You're listening to The Scrimmage with Daniel Hargrove and Justin Domashevitz.
I want to make sure it sinks in. So one time, before we start real quick, let's all be quiet. Andrew, will you play the new imaging for the mailbag segment?
The mailbag.
Yes,
Send
the mailbag.
us your stuff. Send us your stuff in a mailbag.
We're going to get some music under that, and it's going to be the new permanent imaging for the mailbag segment. That was a song that Daniel sang last week on the show leading into the mailbag. Now, we have a couple questions here I think are both interesting. This first one, which I think is one of the most interesting questions we've ever gotten on the mailbag segment. This comes from Dany.
Oh, man.
If your nose had to be relocated to another part of your body and had to be below your shoulder blades, where would you want it located? Keeping in mind that the nose still holds all normal functions of smell and sensitivity when struck. So you have to keep in mind, if it hits, if your nose gets hit, it's still going to hurt and it still has to smell things. So, I mean, I feel like the most natural place to put it without, the smell issue is you'd put it in your pants, because that's a place that you're already,
no smell issue.
You're already protecting it from being struck.
Yeah.
You're already protecting this area, the crotchal region, from being struck. So
yeah, but then you just smell your butt all the time.
That's what I'm saying. Without the element of smell, I feel like that's the easy choice. But I don't want to smell my butt, and I don't want to smell anything that's in my pants, really. So it brings up the interesting question of where could you put your nose to protect it and not have to worry so much about the smell?
Ugh, it's a tough one. I'm leaning towards the chest region, so you could still smell things, put something up to your chest to smell it. You don't get hit in the chest too often, I guess, but I don't know. Maybe the stomach area. I was thinking maybe hand, but you might bump it on things. So that's another tough region. The smell and sensitivity really makes this a tough thing to try and get
What about the backside of your knee?
But then you'd pinch it every time you bent your legs.
Yeah, that's a good point. No, yeah, you wouldn't want that. Could you not bend your See, the hard part is the below the shoulder blade disclaimer on this, because I think the shoulder could be a good option for where you could want your nose to go, but it has to be lower than that. To me, the idea of having it on my chest or my stomach, not so much about the smell, but about the sensitivity, because I work as a courier. I'm a package deliverer. I am holding things in that area all the time, and I have stuff pressed up against my chest and my stomach constantly throughout my workday, so I definitely don't want it there.
So I have one spot that I think might work well, except for me, because I have a really weird complex about wanting things to be even on my body, and it's really weird. But I was thinking maybe the backside of the elbow, because usually you don't want your funny bone to get hit with anything, so you're trying not to hit things with your elbow. I know that would affect your basketball playing, Justin, because you totally elbow the crap out of everybody. But I think the backside of the elbow might be a spot.
So I was thinking the front of the forearm, right up here, is where you could protect. I'm not trying to hit anything with that part. It'd still be kind of weird, but that's where I had pinpointed as the one spot I can imagine it wouldn't not being horrible.
It would require a significant adjustment, because as we speak, my forearms are against my side. And if my nose was on the inside of my arm, I wouldn't want it there. But I think you could, over time, learn to kind of keep one of your arms poked out from your side a little bit. And because it's inside, the inside of the forearm where you were describing, because you wouldn't have to worry too much about it getting hit from inside stuff. You could protect it against your side and using your arm.
Yeah.
That might be the winner. I mean, the smell thing is a really big issue because my initial thoughts were like all in an area that you wouldn't want to smell.
Exactly.
Although,
my initial thoughts too.
Would you get used to the smell to the point that it didn't bother you?
Yeah, but then imagine anytime you wanted to smell something, you'd have to like put it down in your crotch area.
Yeah,
like
that's
just that. So is
This
everybody going to be
coffee's
dealing with
delicious.
this, or is everybody going to be dealing with this so it's normal, or are you just the one weirdo who has to put things in your pants to smell it?
With no
No,
nose.
the way the question is phrased, I think you're the only weirdo. What about? Okay, here's a thought. What about inner thigh just above the knee? So if you're wearing shorts, it would be really easy for it to be accessible, but it's on the inner part of your leg, which probably doesn't take nearly as much a beating as the front or back or the outer part of your leg.
I like that, except I usually sleep on my side,
Ooh,
so
yeah.
that would be a little tough.
That would be hard on the inner part of your forearm too.
Oh, that's a good point. But not as much, maybe. I don't know. This is a tough one.
I think that the big part of this is which one you care more about. Like, if your nose gets struck, or do you care about the smell? Which one's going to bother you more?
I smell bothers me more, so I think I'm leaning more towards I'm just gonna have to protect a different part of my body.
Yeah.
So I think that the smell thing, because that's more of a constant, I'll just have to end up protecting something a little bit more than I normally would.
What about in your armpit?
No, what?
You wear deodorant, it doesn't smell in there.
Yeah, but then you're
It smells
constantly
like
smelling your deodorant.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I think if I
And then remember, smell is a huge influencer in how you taste things. So I don't know about you guys, but with this whole COVID-19 thing going on, I've been using hand sanitizer a lot. And because of that, I'll use hand sanitizer and then I'll take a drink of my water and it tastes like I'm drinking hand sanitizer.
Yep, I agree.
So if I'm
Hand-
constantly smelling deodorant, then that means I'm going to be tasting deodorant with everything I eat.
So basically, you can't put it on your back. You can't put it anywhere in your underwear area because of the smell. You can't put it on your back because it's exposed. It'd be really hard to have it on your legs because that's kind of a hard place to protect. I feel like Andrew's suggestion of just below the elbow, inner forearm is probably the best place to put it.
I'm completely down with that. If I could have like half a nose, one nostril on this side, and half a nose, one nostril on the other side.
You can't. It's one nose. You have to have it on one side or the other.
No.
You have to drop your OCD at the door.
I'm just going to constantly wear an armband on this side with like a ping pong ball in it.
You'd suffocate. You'll suffocate.
No,
the
one
opposite
on
side.
So opposite side. So I have something on both sides.
Then you'll only have an arm sleeve on one side.
Don't try and think too much into it because when I do, it messes me up. You don't know how long it took me to get used to wearing a wedding ring without having something on the other hand. Way too long.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to the next question, which is a little more sportsy. This one comes from Hutton, who's a good friend of ours.
Oh,
it says,
Hutton.
"What's the greatest?" And this is a slightly self-serving question.
this is a lot.
Come on, Hut.
Hut says,
self-serving
Come on, Hut.
question.
What's the greatest Grays Harbor high school football season of the last decade? Greatest Grays Harbor high school football season of the last decade. And the reason that I find this question so intriguing is it says season and not team.
Yes.
But I think the two best teams from the last decade from Grays Harbor were both in 2012.
Absolutely.
Because 2012 is the year that Montesano won the state championship when Hutton was a freshman and playing on the defensive line. They had Matthew Jensen at quarterback. They had Ben Ohashi and Chad Rogers as receivers. They had Elliot Mendenhall and Tucker Ababo as running backs. And that is a story that eventually will need to be told in a way that has a lot of depth, because that's the year that Hoquiam running back Nolan Hoynes went to Montesano's Rottle Field and broke his team's rushing record. That was the year that Montesano's grandstands burned down and they had to play home games elsewhere. That was the year that when they got to go back to Rottle Field to play on senior night, they had no stands. And people, the PA guys and the media guys, were either wandering the sidelines or in a scissor lift to be able to see the field. Like, the story of that season for Montesano, when they won the championship, when Matthew Jensen was the quarterback and his dad, Terry Jensen, was the head coach, is an incredible story. But they may not have been the best football team in Grays Harbor that year.
Yeah, that was a crazy, crazy year. And those two teams, Hoquiam and Montesano, that year were so even in so many different respects. I mean, their defenses were insane. Their talent was insane. The two major differences was that, I mean, the biggest major difference, I think, when those teams played each other in that game was Nolan Hoynes. He was a talent that was transcendent of high school. I mean, he went on to play college football, and I think that was a huge difference in that game. Obviously, he broke the rushing record for his school in that game, which is insane to do, not against a lower level team. Like, that was the biggest thing to me, that was so impressive to me, is he did that against Montesano's defense, who had a crazy good defense. And the fact that he was able to do that was just the difference maker in that game, was that they didn't have an answer to stop Nolan Hoynes in that matchup. But the question is the best season. And that's why we're like, come on, Hutton, you know where we're going to lean to on this one, because there's only been one state championship in Grays Harbor in the last decade in football, and that is the Montesano Bulldogs. And it comes down to both of those teams had a shot at the same team. Both of those teams played Kings, and that Kings squad, really good, led by a quarterback who went on to play at BYU in, I think his name is Billy King. Might be messing that name up a little bit, but he was a heck of a player, and that season was absolutely amazing. And I remember that season vividly for both schools. And Justin, you know that I know a lot of those kids from Hoquiam. Like, some of them are good friends of mine. Ned, anytime I have a softball team that needs a player, he is the first dude I call, is Jake Winned, because he is not only an amazing football player that year playing on the defensive line, but he was also a heck of a baseball player and one of the best softball players I am around. So anytime I'm doing a super draft or calling somebody for a tournament or whatever it is, I call Jake Winned, and we'll have conversations every now and then about that season and how talented they were, because that team was ridiculously good, and yet they lost to Kings. Montesano beats them the next week, and Montesano rolls over whoever else they play. And every time I talk to a Hoquiam kid, they're like, man, we would have beat that team. We would have beat that team. And every time I'm like, yeah, you guys would have steamrolled that team, but you couldn't get past Kings. And that's the big rub on that season for all of those Hoquiam kids. Montesano beat that Kings team and therefore had the greatest season. But your discussion of which was the better team is still left up in the air.
Well, I hate to pick on Jake Winned here. He did once give me a concussion in a flag football game.
Yes.
And also, Jake Winned as a softball player is the kind of guy who you love on the beginning of Saturday and towards the end of Saturday, and maybe on Sunday morning you don't love Jake so much. Okay?
No,
so then...
no. Jake knows a lot of those people, but Jake has been a solid number one draft pick for me every single time. He jokes like he might not be the player you like later in the day, but Jake is solid. He will hit dingers and doubles all day. Don't give me that.
Well, maybe I'm trying to smear him a little bit because I haven't quite gotten over the flag football concussion that he inflicted upon me many years ago. Okay?
Understandable.
No,
He
actually,
still laughs about that, by the way, too.
truth be told, I really like Jake, and Jake and I have talked about that multiple times since then, that particular situation. And it is kind of funny in a way because, like when I watch movies with my kids from the 90s and like somebody falls and hits their heads and they see birds and everyone laughs, I'll be like, oh yeah, that's back when head injuries were funny. So there was a time in America where head injuries were funny. And Jake, when we played in that football tournament, he was like fresh out of high school and didn't quite know how to flip off the aggressiveness switch when I was an old guy and I already knew how to do it. So,
was it the same year?
It was, I believe it was the year after. It was the super draft that we played at Hoke Williams Emerson School, I believe.
Well, I remember the same year that Montesano got knocked out, I came back from the state semifinal game, I believe, with Montesano, and I came back and we're talking to a lot of those guys at that field. But was it the next year that he gave you the concussion?
Yeah, it was fresh out of high school, the year out of high school. So,
okay.
Yes. But I would say going away from Jake Gwynedd, because I do like him. I like to take shots at him. It's fun. But I like him. He's a good dude. But going back to those 2012 teams, you mentioned they both had a shot at Kings. Well, Hoquiam came out in their game against Kings and said, I don't care how good they are. We're just going to do what we do and trust that our players are better than yours. But guess what happened at halftime? Kings adjusted in the game for what Hoquiam was doing, and Hoquiam had no adjustment back. So thinking back on it as like, I'm a Monty guy, but I love that Hoquiam team too. Nolan Hoynes is one of the best running backs I've covered in my years here. To see that team have their season halted because of what I felt like was a coaching deficiency was frustrating because they had no response for Kings's adjustments. And they just said, well, we've been winning this way all season. Didn't take into account the fact that they were playing against a higher level of competition and perhaps a higher level of coaching. So Hoquiam loses to Kings. I'm taking shots at people. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to apologize for that. Okay. Now, Montesano goes into it with a defensive strategy that is tailored, a pages long defensive strategy that is tailored to stopping Kings. And they beat them in that game. So it's frustrating to think back on it because that Hoquiam team with Nolan Hoynes, was that the year they had Evan Erickson at quarterback?
Yes.
They had Paul Gertz.
And I love Evan, but that was the other difference is Matthew Jensen, next level quarterback in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. And I recall thinking about Evan too, that when the weather got wetter, he had a little bit of a harder time throwing the ball, but he was a fantastic athlete. Nolan Hoynes was a fantastic athlete. Paul Gertz was a fantastic athlete. Ronnie Espedal was incredible, especially at his size.
I forgot Ronnie was on that team.
Absolutely. And offensively, he was really good. But defensively, he was even better.
Ronnie was amazing defensively. And on any other team, he probably would have been the starting running back.
Yeah.
But because Nolan was there, he played offensive guard.
Yeah.
How many offensive guards do you then see play point guard in basketball?
He didn't just play offensive guard. He embraced offensive guard. And he was so strong that he was an incredible offensive guard. And he was also an incredible linebacker. So the amount of athleticism from top to bottom that Grizzly team had was really incredible. So they went to Roddle Field and they beat Montesano that season. Then Montesano, led by Matthew Jensen, who, as you mentioned, was a next level quarterback. Then you had Shad Rogers and Ben Ohashi as your main receivers. Ohashi, one of the best receivers I've seen play at Montesano. And then you had Tucker Ababo and Elliot Mendenhall at running back, who both had an incredible championship game against Royal at the Dome. Those were two really, really good teams. Montesano's story about how they got to where they were is really incredible. But I think even if you ask most of those Bulldog players, they don't want to line up against Hoquiam in the playoffs. If they'd end up playing Hoquiam instead of Kings in the playoffs, I'm not sure how confident they would have felt about that game.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I feel like they felt like Kings, while a really good overall team, had one player that they really had to scheme to figure out to stop. And was it an easy job? Absolutely not. You mentioned pages-long defensive strategy to stop a college-level quarterback, a Division I level quarterback, and they did it. Hoquiam, the athletes they had were hard to scheme against. Like, they were just playing that good, and I think that you're absolutely right. And that's the biggest bummer of it to me as well is how often do you get a chance to see two teams from the same county go up against each other in the state playoffs in a football game?
In a football game, not often, but when it's Hoquiam and Montesano in the state playoffs, it's a lot in other sports.
It is. And we were so hoping to see that at Stewart Field, and yet we were robbed of that. And I think that would have been a game of epic proportions because I do think Monty would have made adjustments from the previous game and it would have been a much closer matchup and we would have seen the rematch that we were all hoping for. Instead, Kings moves on and it's Montesano who does the amazing job of taking and making adjustments. And goodness gracious, the defensive game plan in that game, I will never forget it. It was absolutely masterful. They were doing things that I have never seen in high school football, ever. I've never seen adjustments of coverages and personnel both before and after the snap like I have seen in that game. It is absolutely amazing to think about how well they played that game defensively. And they absolutely deserved to win the state championship game. I'm bummed out that we didn't get to see the Hoquiam Monty rematch of those two absolute powerhouses that year from Grace Harbor County.
I agree. And when you think about all the speed that Montesano had on the field on defense with Ohashi and Rogers and Mendenhall and Ababo, and Hutton was a freshman at that point. But as a defensive lineman, when he was a senior, as a defensive lineman, he led the team in tackles. Because Insane. He was so fast that he would catch everybody all the time. So all the speed that they had on that field, they couldn't stop Nolan Hoynes. Yeah. That kid had an acceleration that was a next level compared to everybody else. And I hate to say it, but like he was the best player on the field in that game. He was so fast and he's so quick and his moves were so incredible in that game that I would be nervous if I was Montesano. I mean, they would have come up with a different scheme than they had in the first matchup with Hoquiam won. But I would have been nervous, Montesano, athlete for athlete, to match up against that Hoquiam team.
Yeah, and Paul Gertz was on that team as well.
So
and
fast.
So fast. And the thing with Nolan, though, was the combination of speed and power.
Yeah.
Because he would just straight run over people, too. And he would run over people who were good, strong tacklers. But again, he was just a different level of athlete. And gosh, you look at those teams and Hutton and Ababo and Rogers and Matthew Jensen was a crazy good linebacker as well. And you just look at the rosters of those teams. And I mean, come on, you know that Hutton Napier is one of our favorite local athletes of all time. We created a hashtag for him, for Pete's sake, hashtag Hut Smash, because by the time he reached his senior year, it was just stupid how good he was. But for him to be starting as a freshman, that's unheard of in the Montesano program. It's absolutely unheard of. And then to be starting on a state championship Montesano team, it's ridiculous. So, I mean, you go up and down the line, and these teams were absolutely insane. And I'm sure we're missing countless other names that we would be like, oh, yeah, that guy was on that team. That guy was on Dakota Boone, another crazy good defensive tackle for Hoquiam. I mean, it's crazy to think of all of the athletes that were on those teams.
I should mention Richard Smith, who was the guy you might remember from the championship game for Montesano against Royal, who caught the Hail Mary tip pass right as the time was expiring in the first half. So yes, there were other good players on that team. Yeah, there were some other really good players.
Gosh, so many of our amazing football coverage memories of following high school football come from that year for both Hoquiam and Montesano. Like it's insane. And the fact that you got to join us on that broadcast, both me and Ian Cope, we figured out a way to have you down on the sidelines was just insane. The fact that all three of us got to cover that game together. It's ridiculous.
I definitely had the best job that day because while you guys were upstairs doing all the heavy lifting, I stood on the sidelines with a microphone. And then, once every few minutes, you would throw it to me for about 15 seconds of analysis of what just happened on the field. But meantime, I got to stand on the sidelines watching what was happening. I was in the trajectory of a touchdown pass from Matthew Jensen to Ben Ohashi on the sidelines to the point that I think if Ohashi hadn't caught it, it would have hit me. It was literally and unequivocally the greatest moment of my sports media career was covering that game. No doubt.
It was so awesome. And I know that a lot of mine and yours memories come to basketball and covering high school basketball teams that we've seen go into the Sun Dome, but we've never covered a state. That's the only state champion that we've covered.
Yep.
And going back to Hutton's question, greatest high school football season, I think he knows it before he asks the question. And I think we know it as well. The greatest season was that Montesano season because they not only lost to Hoquiam, they lost another game after.
They lost to Cascade Christian.
They lost after that stadium burned down, and that's when you find out all the stories about going into team meetings and who's gonna what was the story? It was something about bailing out water or something like that. I can't remember the exact wordage of it. Maybe you do better, but I mean, so many amazing stories come from that season, and the greatest season goes to that team. The greatest team can be debated, but I mean, there's only one state champion in the last decade in high school football in Grace Harbor, and that goes to Montesano.
I'm telling you, it's a story that needs to be told. There have been a lot of rumors circulating that Matthew Jensen had been working on potentially writing a book to tell the story of that season. I am waiting, holding my breath, waiting for that book because I am so excited to hear the full story. I would love to also maybe have an interview with Matthew Jensen at some point to talk about his experience, not only as the state champion quarterback, but also the son of the head coach of the team and the culmination of several years of work being able to come out in a state championship victory in his senior season.
Absolutely. I would read that book. I mean,
I don't read books, but I'd read that book.